Paul discovered that his wife, Betty, was unhappy in their marriage. One day, he pulled back the curtain in their home and saw another man in the neighboring apartment. Betty didn't bother to explain and instead handed Paul divorce papers. Surprisingly, Paul didn't react with anger. Instead, he smiled, turned around, and left without saying much. A few days earlier, Paul had an unexpected meeting with a woman named Victoria on a train. Her luggage spilled onto the floor, and Paul offered to help. As he reached for the luggage, the train jolted, and they nearly bumped into each other. During the commotion, Victoria accidentally picked up Paul's ticket without realizing it. This small mix-up would unexpectedly connect their lives. Because of the ticket issue, Paul was forced to get off the train early. He quickly hopped onto a bus, only to run into Victoria again. During their conversation, they figured out they had swapped tickets. Victoria apologized, and Paul accepted it gracefully. Paul had hoped for a smooth journey, but trouble came in the form of two thugs who started harassing Victoria. Paul stood up to defend her, but the situation escalated. Both Paul and the thugs were thrown off the train for causing a disturbance. Paul decided to walk to the next station, but soon crossed paths with Victoria again. Paul assumed she had waited for him to apologize for the earlier trouble. However, Victoria explained she wasn't going home because she was scared. She confided in him that she had been abandoned by her boyfriend after becoming pregnant. Now, she feared her father's reaction when he found out. As Victoria cried, Paul came up with an idea. He asked what would happen if her husband showed up. Victoria explained that her father would probably calm down if her husband visited briefly, stayed for a night, and then left. Paul offered to help her by pretending to be her husband. Reluctantly, Victoria agreed. They decided Paul would go home with her, play the role of her husband, and leave the next day. Paul planned to stay for just one night and leave the next morning with a good excuse. On their journey, he and Victoria began to open up to each other. Paul, a war veteran, shared how his wife had encouraged him to sell chocolates for a living, but having recently returned from the battlefield, he struggled to adjust to normal life. Carrying a bag of chocolates, he wandered from place to place, searching for meaning in life. As they walked, Victoria suddenly stopped and pointed to her home down the mountain. Her family owned a vineyard near the Mexican border, known as Paradise in the Clouds. Paul decided to lighten the mood. He took some chocolate wrappers and fashioned them into rings, slipping one onto Victoria's finger and another onto his own. Their playful moment was interrupted by gunfire, shattering the silence. Paul quickly shielded Victoria. A stern-looking man emerged with a rifle in hand. Victoria calmly said, "Don't shoot." "Hello, Dad." Her father's first words were harsh. "Who is he?" Victoria introduced Paul as her husband. As expected, her father was furious. He had planned for Victoria to marry a nobleman and saw her bringing home Paul as a betrayal of the family's honor. The father aired his complaints to every family member. However, Victoria's mother and grandmother welcomed Paul warmly, showing no prejudice against him. In desperation, the father turned to the head of the family, his own father, to seek support. Surprisingly, the grandfather, Pedro Alvin, greeted Paul warmly, saying, "Welcome to our happy family." To mark Paul's arrival, the family prepared an extravagant dinner. During the meal, Paul and Victoria shared their story of how they met. Their account was heartfelt and convincing, but the father remained unmoved. He grew even colder upon learning that Paul was raised in an orphanage. Sneering, he remarked, "My daughter married a man with neither a past nor a future." Victoria defended Paul, but her father's cutting words wounded him deeply. Unable to endure the humiliation, Paul left the table quietly, feeling defeated. Later, Paul apologized to Victoria. He admitted that as a child, he used to look up at the stars, imagining each one carried his hope for a loving family. Though hurt by the father's words, Paul confessed he could understand a father's protective instincts. "If I were in his place, maybe I'd feel the same," he said. Victoria disagreed. "You wouldn't," she insisted. Paul, unsure, replied, "I don't know." Trying to ease the tension, Paul joked about leaving early the next morning, saying the worst part of the visit was already behind them. But when he looked at Victoria, he saw a trace of sadness in her eyes. It was as though she didn't want him to leave so soon. In line with local traditions, newlyweds were expected to sleep in the master bedroom. Victoria's mother placed a red rose on the bedside table, symbolizing a lifelong bond between the couple. Afterward, she went to calm her disgruntled husband, who was upset not only about Paul taking their daughter, but also about him occupying the master bedroom. The wife reminded him of another tradition. If the newlyweds didn't receive their parents' blessings on their wedding night, they wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. She urged him to set aside his frustration and wish the couple a good night. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Paul had prepared the bed so that he and Victoria could sleep separately. Victoria asked him why, but before he could explain, there was a knock at the door. It was her father. Paul quickly hid the extra bedding and they pretended to be in an embrace. Although their act seemed convincing, her father's sharp eyes caught the pile of sheets in the corner. Fortunately, he didn't say anything and left the room. Worried someone else might check on them, Paul and Victoria decided to share the bed. As they lay there, Victoria turned her head and met Paul's gaze. Their eyes locked, conveying emotions they couldn't put into words. The atmosphere grew charged, and for a brief moment, the line between acting and reality blurred. But Paul stopped himself before anything could happen, held back by the weight of their circumstances. That night, Paul was haunted by memories of the battlefield. His restless nightmares filled the room with tension until Victoria gently comforted him, soothing his troubled mind. Suddenly, the vineyard's alarm bells rang out, breaking the stillness of the night. Everyone rushed to the vineyard, lighting bonfires to keep the grapes warm. Paul joined in, guided by Victoria. Together they moved gracefully through the vines, their actions almost like a dance. For the first time since leaving the war, Paul felt a sense of belonging and the warmth of family. Watching them, Victoria's father began to soften, his hardened heart slowly thawing. The next morning, Paul prepared to leave as planned, using the excuse of a business trip. As he reached the door, Victoria's grandfather stopped him and invited him for a walk around the vineyard. During their stroll, the grandfather spoke fondly about the family's legacy. He explained how, 400 years ago, their ancestors had brought grapevine seeds from Spain, and every grape in the vineyard came from the same legendary tree. The tree, he said, was the foundation of their family and its future, including Paul, now that he was part of their lives. The grandfather shared that the annual harvest festival was taking place the next day and sincerely asked Paul to stay and experience the celebration. But Paul had already made up his mind to leave. Paul is determined to leave, but Victoria's grandfather tries different ways to persuade him. Finally, he takes a direct approach. "You will follow her. You will stand by her. She will be by your side." These words resonate with Paul, and he agrees to stay for another day. When Paul sees Victoria still by his side, a genuine smile lights up his face. The Manor's Harvest Day is the most festive event of the year, and Paul decides to take part. However, being inexperienced, he fumbles clumsily at first. With Victoria's patient guidance, he gradually finds his rhythm and starts enjoying the work. While working, Paul accidentally drops a bunch of grapes. Victoria's father picks them up, brushes off the dust, and puts them in his basket. As he walks away, he glances back at Paul with a challenging smirk, as if daring him to respond. This silent exchange sparks an unspoken competition. Paul works harder, and Victoria's father matches his pace, turning the task into an intense but playful rivalry. They race across the fields, determined not to lose to each other. In the end, Victoria's father finishes first and proudly shows off his overflowing basket. But in his excitement, he drops 2 bunches of grapes. Paul imitates his earlier actions, picking up the fallen grapes, dusting them off, and adding them to his basket. Seeing this, Victoria's father laughs, breaking the tension and making the moment both humorous and heartwarming. Next comes a key step in the winemaking process. Victoria's grandmother blows a horn, signaling the start of a traditional ritual. All the married women step into large vats filled with grapes, laughing and stomping to mix the juice with yeast. As music from the band plays, the women's lively movements and laughter fill the air, turning the process into a celebration. As the mood grows more cheerful, the crowd decides to toss Paul into the vat. His presence adds to the excitement, and the atmosphere becomes even more spirited. Amid the festivities, Paul and Victoria finally give in to their feelings and share a passionate kiss. However, Paul's joy is short-lived. He quickly realizes the weight of his actions. He isn't truly free, and this impulsiveness could hurt Victoria. Guilt and inner conflict drive him to spend the night alone on the sofa. The next morning, Paul hears Victoria's father and brother discussing the management of the vineyard. He gets up quickly, but his actions don't escape Victoria's father's notice. Remembering that Paul had slept on the floor the first night and now on the sofa, he becomes suspicious. This behavior doesn't align with what he expects from a newlywed couple. Victoria notices her father's unease and tries to defuse the situation, but he directly confronts her. "What is really going on between you and this man?" he demands. Victoria looks at Paul, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, guilt, and uncertainty. Paul knew it was time to leave. He couldn't stay any longer, so he went to Victoria's grandmother to collect his belongings. As he prepared to depart, he noticed Victoria suddenly doubled over in severe abdominal pain. Concerned, he rushed to help her to her room, but Victoria refused his assistance. She firmly told Paul that he should leave without delay. She explained that prolonging his stay wouldn't solve anything. The truth would eventually come out, and everyone needed to find their rightful place in life. Though Paul understood her words, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease and decided to follow her discreetly. Instead of finding Victoria, Paul ran into her father in the warehouse. The father still refused to accept their marriage, but Paul couldn't hold back his frustration. "Don't you see your own faults?" Paul asked. "You neglect your daughter. She's afraid of you because you've never truly cared for her. She's incredible, beautiful, and special. Look around you. This land, this grass, the life you've built 365 days a year. Who do you think I'm doing all of this for? It's for her, for everyone in this family. I love my family. You should tell them that too." Paul's raw honesty left the father speechless, unable to offer a rebuttal. Sometimes people direct their harshest behavior at those they care about most, and Paul's words seemed to strike a nerve. Feeling unresolved, Paul gathered his unwashed clothes, still torn about leaving. As he turned to go, the grandfather stopped him, mistakenly thinking Paul and Victoria were merely having a minor lover's spat. The old man offered advice, saying that men should remain rational while women often let emotions guide them. Although his words sounded practical, they failed to address the deeper issues between Paul and Victoria. The grandfather's mood softened over time, and as the evening wore on, he called in a band. Hoping to lift Paul's spirits, he taught him an old country love song that had once won the grandmother's heart. Fueled by the grandfather's encouragement and perhaps a little wine, Paul mustered the courage to sing the love song outside Victoria's window. According to tradition, if a girl turned on her light during the serenade, it meant she accepted the boy's feelings. Paul sang his heart out, and even Victoria's father seemed moved by the gesture. But when the song ended, the light remained off. Defeated yet resolute, Paul picked up his luggage and left the estate. While his song didn't light Victoria's window, it reached her heart. However, the moment for them simply wasn't right. The next day, the town celebrated the harvest. As Paul waited for a bus at the station, he noticed Victoria in the distance. Their eyes met, and there was no regret or hesitation, only a quiet acceptance of their fate. However, moved by Paul's heartfelt love song the night before, Victoria's father publicly introduced Paul to the priest and the townspeople as his son-in-law. He announced, "Tonight, I will host a formal wedding for my daughter and her husband." His tone was resolute yet open, inviting everyone to join in the celebration. Paul, standing far from the scene, hesitated, urging Victoria to explain everything to her father, but Victoria insisted on handling it herself. Paul, no longer fearful, gave her a medal of courage, symbolizing his trust in her. They shared a deeply sincere kiss, their parting filled with mutual respect. Later, Victoria confessed the entire truth to her father. From afar, the emotional shock rippled through the family as they grappled with the revelations. Meanwhile, Paul left on a passing car by the seaside, but his thoughts lingered on the vineyard. He drifted into a dream, one that took him back to the battlefield. Yet this time, amidst the chaos, he envisioned a child, Victoria, and the idyllic paradise in the clouds. At that moment, he realized the answers he sought, hope, love, and belonging, were rooted there, in that paradise. Awakening from his reverie, Paul returned home with renewed clarity. When he saw his wife's nervous gaze, he gently pulled back the curtains, sensing that their chapter was ending. His wife handed him a divorce agreement, almost like a gift of fate. It brought him relief and freed him from the burdens that had weighed on his soul. Under her puzzled expression, Paul quickly made preparations, ready to chase the paradise he had dreamed of. Back at the vineyard, Victoria's father was awoken by a sudden commotion. Disoriented, he struggled to recall why he had been so furious with Paul. When Paul arrived to formally ask for his blessing, the father's simmering anger flared again. Paul tried to explain and even presented the divorce papers to prove his sincerity, but the father's outrage overwhelmed him. He saw it as a deep insult to their family and threatened drastic action against Paul. In the midst of the escalating argument, Victoria arrived to de-escalate the situation. But in the chaos, the father accidentally knocked over a kerosene lamp and flames erupted among the grapevines. Everyone sprang into action, trying desperately to contain the fire, but it spread uncontrollably, consuming the vineyard. Despite their best efforts, the centuries-old estate was reduced to ashes by morning. Amid the devastation, the father-in-law finally grasped the magnitude of what had been lost. Grief-stricken, he tried to rush into the flames, but was held back by the grandfather. As the fire smoldered, the old man mourned aloud, "Our roots have been severed." At that moment, Paul remembered the family's ancestral tree, the symbol of their lineage and unity. A glimmer of hope flickered in his mind as he resolved to save what little remained of their legacy. Paul rushed to the mountain, where he uprooted the charred remains of the ancestral tree, carefully preserving its roots. He carried it back to the devastated vineyard for everyone to see. The father-in-law inspected the roots and, cutting into a small piece, discovered a miraculous truth. The roots were still alive. "It's still alive! It's still alive!" the father-in-law exclaimed, his voice filled with hope and wonder. His eyes sparkled with newfound excitement as he turned to Paul. "This is the root of the family, and now it is your root too." The words echoed the wisdom of the grandfather, reminding everyone of the legacy they shared. In that moment, the father-in-law, once stubborn and unyielding, had learned the true meaning of love and family through the loss of everything he held dear. He handed the living roots to Paul, urging him to plant them himself. This act symbolized not just the rebirth of the vineyard, but also the start of a new chapter for the family. Paul, with Victoria by his side, planted the roots with care, their hands working together to secure a foundation for the future. As sunlight broke through the dust and lingering smoke, it illuminated the vineyard in a soft golden glow. The air felt alive with hope and renewal, as if the world itself were celebrating the couple's union. At last, Paul and Victoria could face their future openly and honestly, free from the burdens and secrets that once kept them apart. The father-in-law, humbled and transformed, supported their happiness, while the rest of the family embraced the new beginning. In the ever-turning flow of fate, Paul and Victoria's story stood as a testament to resilience and love. It was a tale woven with unexpected twists and turns, each moment shaped by destiny's hand. Now, their paradise in the clouds was not just a dream, it was a reality, nurtured by hope and rooted in their shared strength.